Hello and welcome to the Cardiff Met Sports Coaching Hub podcast.
I'm Oli Lum.
And I'm Mike Castle.
We're here to bring you insights around all of the latest cutting-edge research within coach education and practice.
You can stay up to date with all of our latest episodes through the links in the podcast description below.
We hope you enjoy the episode.
Okay, welcome back to another episode of the Cardiff Met Sports Coaching Hub podcast. I'm your host for today, Mike Castle. I don't have a co-host today because Ollie sat on the other side of the table as a guest. So, Ollie, role reversal today. How are you feeling about it?
I'm bricking it, mate, to be honest. So it's a lot more comfortable over there, I think. So,
because I've got the interview guide, so I guess I've got control.
Yeah, absolutely.
I get to slip in the extra questions that you're not expecting, etc. Geth, Chris O'Neill, welcome back. How many episodes now?
I think it's 2 or 3. I was going to check.
You're becoming a regular.
It's becoming, a regular. It is. I think it's my 3rd one.
And part of the topic of conversation today is Vygotsky. So Vygotsky's becoming a regular on the podcast as well. We are here to talk about a paper that the pair of you have been working on. I suppose Ollie's been working on as part of his PhD. So, Ol, that's your cue to kick us off. Where did the inspiration for your PhD and what's formed this paper come from?
A couple of things, really. So you mentioned Vygotsky and the initial interest there for the original PhD and the overall PhD was kind of grounded in it being both one of the first things I experienced as an undergraduate here at Cardiff Met, and Geth actually was the one to teach me Vygotsky, I think, in my first year of my undergraduate. So it was quite a nice place to start when thinking about potential topics. But it also fell in line with Geth, your paper that you wrote with Robin in 2018 around what Vygotsky can teach sport coaches. So there's quite a nice, almost well-roundedness to me kind of applying for a PhD in 2019 to the paper having been published the year before. My first experiences of sport coaching research being Vygotsky at Cardiff Met in about 2014. And then the distance running element came from what was kind of my passion as an athlete from the age of kind of 14, 15.
Perfect. So, what you've done there is you've thrown Geth under the bus because Geth has been here for how many years now? Does that mean when was your undergrad? A little while now.
Yeah, it's actually 11 years, isn't it? So that you're one of my first undergrad students.
Must be something quite nice about that for you, though, Geth, that your work or like your delivery and then the papers that you're writing is having an impact on an individual like Ollie to then do a whole PhD on the topic area.
Yeah, I think Ollie's probably an excellent example of how somebody from coming in at undergraduate and working the way through, starting with sports coaching in 2014, you said.
Yeah.
Used to roll in on a Thursday morning. Not the best day for undergraduates to be taught, but he was always there every week, very enthusiastic. A bit quiet to start off with, would you say? I think it'd be fair. A thinker, and then, as the years progressed, as he worked through his undergraduate, we sort of identified him as someone with ability, and then from there, you went into you started the masters, didn't you? Here, which would be more Vygotsky, and then the opportunity came to do the PhD. So, which was funded, wasn't it, by the ESRC funding for that?
Yeah. So yeah, it was kind of a real nice journey for me to be able to just stay, and then obviously working here now as well, kind of caps it off quite nicely.
And you've had the opportunity to feed in some of that stuff from the PhD into the curriculum now at the university as well?
Yes, I've delivered some bits of it on the DSc program, so the taught doctorate last year, I think, or maybe the year before as well. And then I've influenced some of the scaffolding work, which sits quite closely to Vygotsky at level 5, so 2nd year as well.
I think what is important as well in true Vygotskian fashion is that you've got a social interaction between, the three of us have got an understanding with your DSc, Doctor Sports Coaching thesis as well, Mike, is that we've got this understanding of Vygotsky together now, and we can build this understanding and in relation to sports coaching. So, he sort of starts the job with Vygotsky, and we're sort of building on that. So that's where it gets really interesting now, is how we take it forward as well.
Yeah, it keeps developing, doesn't it? Reading the paper, and we'll get into the nuts and bolts of it in a minute, but reading the paper, it sort of inspires things that I've not thought of in relation to my PhD findings. And obviously, Geth, your work informs a lot of that as well. So it's almost feels like there's almost a never-ending building on top of of what's coming out of the origins of Vygotsky's ideas here. I want to quickly, before we get into the content of it, what's the process been like for you in terms of taking this ginormous PhD and turning it into a publication or a draft for publication, which is considerably smaller in terms of the word count and the restrictions on you there? What's that been like?
Yeah, I think for me, I actually did quite a lot of the legwork for this before submitting the PhD. So I thought about it quite a lot when we were drafting my discussion section. So the PhD was written almost in, if you really kind of chopped it up, you could have almost 4 discussion sections for 4 different papers there. This one that we're going to talk about today, this kind of being fast and running fast, that was 1 section. I think the subsequent papers after this one might combine 2. So maybe we get 3 overall, something like that. So I did a bit of the groundwork there. What has been hard is the methodology, of course, has been trying to write in the exact methods that we use to find this aspect of the findings rather than just replicating my methodology for what was a wider action research piece that this is obviously spawned out of, but it's not a complete discussion around that.
Yeah, okay. And so why this particular finding then? If you've got 3 or 4 sections you could be writing about, what's the importance, the relevance of this one? Why start with this one?
For me, this is the one that I think it speaks to distance running coaches. I hate to use the expression on the ground, but I think it speaks to coaches first and foremost. And it also speaks to an issue that I think is prevalent within research around not just distance running, but endurance literature in general. So we're talking triathlon, swimming, cycling, running in this instance. And it's, I guess, part of a wider body of work that I'd like to work on that extends the PhD as well. So I think this would be the one to kick off with, if you like, to start that other work as well.
Perfect. And so Geth, for you, Oli brings you an idea for this PhD thesis. What is it about the project that interests you? Why do you sit up and go, okay, yeah, we'll take this one. Let's turn this into a PhD idea?
Well, it actually, it was probably, it would start a while back, even before Oli came along, really, because this would be an idea where it started discussions with me and Robin initially, with Robin Jones, around Vygotsky's ideas, and the paper that Oli mentioned. You had Rodrigo and Tweem from Brazil, and they both visited over the, I think it was sort of late 2015 to 2020, in that period, and from their ideas we started developing Vygotsky into the doctorate. So that's we started introducing the ideas there, and from there Oli came along and we started discussing the ideas, and that's how that evolved into the PhD. So then Oli put his twist on it would be the athletic side, wouldn't it, really? Because we initially had different ideas of doing it in team sports or with working with other coaches, but that's how it came about. So really, I was thinking about this. So you sort of standing on the shoulders of giants. It starts off in the 1930s, and Vygotsky was influenced by someone, and you just keep going along those lines, and you come to get to us now. So that's where, it wasn't, it's not, it's a building on a real historical, cultural thing. It's history, knowledge, and then we're building on knowledge and continue to build on it. So we've arrived here. And well, we're not, and we're still going. Well, we never arrive, and you keep going.
Yeah, almost poetic, given the underpinnings of Lev's work. Absolutely. So let's get into it then. So the title of the paper, "Being Fast and Running Fast." Let's set the scene a little bit. Where does that quote come from? What does it refer to?
I think this links to my original personal experiences of being a runner, being someone who coached running, was obsessed, I think is a fair comment to make about how I viewed distance running and the sport of distance running, and my own personal experiences, and then realizing my own personal experiences and difficulties and making me realize how difficult the task might be to alter coaches' practice. So essentially what I'm referring to with being fast is this idea of being physiologically capable of completing a race at a fast pace, for example. How quick are you in the lab? What's your personal best? There we go. Running fast is slightly different in terms of this is what you're actually able to do when the gun goes, and when there's a lot of external factors. There's potentially hundreds of other competitors in a cross-country race or a marathon, maybe 20 or so who are actually real competitors with you, and being able to do that on that stage. And one of the, I guess even the wake-up calls I had during my PhD was I was still in doing my master's, probably even doing the lit review for my PhD. I was still look at my own bad running performances through the lens of physiology. So I might have a bad race and I'd look back and think, I should have done a couple more 400s last week, or maybe I haven't run at a low enough heart rate for the past couple months, for example. Whereas then I look at my hockey coaching, so I coach hockey as well, and played hockey as well. And I was always thinking about learning Vygotsky and all these ideas that I'd got from my degree. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm someone that has come through 3 years of undergrad, a couple of years postgraduate studies, started a PhD, and I'm still looking at my own performances and thinking about the hard science, if you like. And the discourse of the sport is so ingrained in me from being a participant as a teenager that I was still doing that myself. And then I thought the aim of my PhD is to alter coaches' practice to be more creative and to consider learning more. And I'm asking them to do that. And me, myself, I'm still looking at my own performances and going straight to the hard science.
Yeah.
So it's essentially about the tensions between the idea of being fast and the idea of running fast.
Perfect. As I find it's just interesting when you talk about, I've not run at a low enough heart rate for enough distance, etc. Well, there's a big thing going on social media at the minute, which is all about zone 2 running.
Yeah.
Running at a conversational pace and things like that, and people racking up miles there in order to be faster when it comes to park run on a Saturday or whatever it might be. So a lot of relevance, I suppose, to the paper and your experiences and what's sort of going on in the world right now, I suppose, in running, having a little bit of a boom at the minute as far as recreationally, socially, as well as competitively. So again, probably some impact there, I suppose, or an audience ready for impact, should we say, in relation to some of your ideas.
Just to, what would happen as well, right, is Oli would turn up when we usually met in the cafe called the Bench here at Cardiff Met, and we'd come up and have some discussions around things. And because I'm sort of interested in, game-based approaches and, learning through the game, I'd often, and, both Robin and I would chat, and in order to just, to challenge some of Oli's ideas, we'd ask him, did they ever teach you to race? And then, do you ever have sessions where there's, you plan to race through? And then more, you've just said hardly ever, isn't it? Nobody ever teaches you how to take part in a race. Now, granted that Olympic qualification or whatever, you've got to make a certain time, but when it comes to the you've got to get from A to B as fast as you can, but you've got to beat people as well. So we never, it was around the tactical or the strategies involved in racing. That's where the conversations would sort of go to, wouldn't it? And we'd have some really fascinating conversations then around the physiological side and tactical, but that seems to be absent.
Yeah. And so you kind of, in the paper as well, you're taking aim a little bit at that physiological sort of grounded and decontextualized nature, I suppose, then of running, training, practice, development. You just spoken there. It's something that you felt as an athlete, looking at your own times, you just going straight for the physiology, that sort of being fast, what you're capable of. So that's, I guess, informed some of the rationale, but how have you managed then your assumptions as you're going through the paper? How have you avoided, I suppose, leaping to any judgment about what's right, wrong, good, bads in relation to what's actually coming out of the data?
Yeah, and I think that's something that I had to be really careful with, in that I probably could have, in a way, written this paper, of course not as well, before I did my PhD. If I'd had the realization, maybe. I think the PhD gave me a bit more of a firm realization about what was really happening, but I think these are some of the practical consequences are things that I was aware of, but seeing elite coaches, elite athletes go through some of these their training regimes, their racing preparation. I've seen it happen at a top level, and I guess that's where the research context is really important in terms of who I work with. So I had the opportunity to work with 3 elite distance running coaches within the UK, and they're kind of associated athletes, and by elite, they all had athletes in the season I worked with them who kind of represented international countries at the European cross country championships.
Mm-hmm.
So a fairly good level, I think it's fair to say, and essentially without giving too much away for what we might chat about now, is they were all doing both. So they were looking at the physiology, but they were also looking at the interactional nature of not just the race itself, but of training and what that physiology meant in practice. Whereas talk about taking aim, and I'm not necessarily taking aim at physiology or even taking aim at papers who are producing kind of social studies around running or distance running training. But I'm just saying we need to, rather than siloing them, study them as one. They are both distance running coaching concepts, and we need to view them as one, rather than having a body of research on one side and another body on the other side. And I think it's I reference the work of Sir Friedman and others' work, and they actually looked at rapid weight loss in wrestling, and they make the comment about how historically coaches and athletes have been left to make connections between silos of natural sciences and social sciences themselves. I think on the ground, that's what has been taking place for forever, really. The coaches are left to make those connections themselves, but the research isn't doing it for them, or perhaps not adequately anyway.
Okay, so question for both of you then. Why is that still happening? Why is it still being left to coaches to join the two things together? Why is this not really been ventured into in enough detail yet, or why has this not been exposed, I suppose, yet?
I think, Oli, you did say, though, that we're not saying that doing this physiological stuff is a bad thing. There is an importance to it, as you keep stressing that, don't you? To get the lactic levels and understanding of that. It's not dismissing that completely. It's how coaches maybe think with these ideas, or how I think a lot of it's quite a traditional thing from sort of reductionist way of looking at things. We need to break things down and then put it all back together in that way. It's a traditional thing of hard science, where if we can find a solution and an answer to something, then we can, if we hit this target, we will win the race. If you can run this quickly, we will win, or lift this amount of weight, and get the maximum effort out of something. It's like a cause and effect. I think the classic example can be the Olympic final. Our favourite man, Inge Brixton, isn't it? On the work that I don't know how many times he came into conversation, but if you put the 1500 metre Olympic final, on a basic who can run the fastest, as Hockett doesn't win. Is it Hockett? Hockett doesn't win. He can't run that fast. What happens in the final? He beats Kerr and Inge Brixton. So, when we're not saying you don't do these things, it's however how you combine them both. As the these everyday concepts and the scientific concept back to Vygotsky together. And the scientific may be scientific in a social theory and a scientific concept itself. A hard science concept.
I think it speaks to a lot of other things as well. Like in all elite sport at the moment, I guess the trend is these multidisciplinary teams, these MDTs, where we bring together sport performance analysis, sport and exercise science, sports psych, the coaches, for example. And I think coaching research, we're focused on the coaches, and we touch upon the micro-political landscape maybe, but I don't think we're really bringing in, or not enough maybe. We could do more to use actual performance analysis knowledge, for example, with coaching practice, rather than taking bits from one and bits from another and like putting them together. Is looking at the whole thing as this is one thing. It's just coaching.
Okay. So this is a little bit more about trying to entertain the ideas of that wider, we're calling them teams here or groups, but entertain the ideas of them, or try to sit all of the different ideas, whether it comes from physiology, if it's performance analysis, if it's physio, but also coaching, and look at them on sort of almost like a level playing field and treat them each with the same, I suppose, value in relation to performance? Or
I think the main difficulty is the separation in the first place, right? It's the fact that we can test physiology in the lab in a running environment, for example, and then we go and coach on the track, and it's separate. We get a physiologist in to do the test, and then we go and run a session based off what they've said, rather than we silo it ourselves by having specialists in each discipline. I'm not saying there's a problem with that, but I guess this is where Vygotsky comes in, right? In terms of this dialectical idea of having interrelated lines of thought that we then bring together as one line of thought, which is distance running coaching or endurance coaching, which encompasses these various ideas, but it's one thing. It's not take this from that, this from that. It's just one and the same.
But that's quite, as I mentioned there, the reductionist thing. If you take away, psychology, biomechanics, physiology, you look at them in separation, and then you try and put them back together, and then suddenly you'll have the best thing, athlete that comes out of it. What we're trying to get is a slightly different approach, isn't it? With, as you said, looking at everything and how that comes in together. That's what what does it take, to be an athlete in athletics? When you're taking part in track and field, really, getting to the essence of what that is and how you coach that. So that wouldn't be really trying to separate, looking at things in isolation and then trying to stick them all back together.
Are you sort of extending, or I don't want to say contradicting, but are you adding a little bit of detail to some of Vygotsky's ideas then? Because when he talks about scientific and everyday concepts, that ultimately is presented then as something external, something new, something different, which might come from psychology or physiology. And then that gets brought into your everyday. And of course, you sort of interact, you go back and forth. Naturally, by calling things scientific and everyday, there is separation. You're suggesting actually through this idea of interrelated lines of thought, there is no separation. They are one and the same.
I think what Vygotsky is arguing for, at least my interpretations of that, though, is creating the singular line of thought, which is then once we have truly learned, or we are a master maybe of running, for example, or a master of running coaching. So I think it's okay for them to start that way, because history has ensured that we are starting in that place. So one paper, or even publish 100 papers on this, is not going to change the fact that physiology exists and this kind of social view of coaching exists. But what we're arguing for is coaches to get to the point where, at least Geth mentioned, between the three of us, for example, we have our own understanding of Vygotsky. If I'm coaching Geth, and between us we have this one interrelated line of thought that links Geth's physiology with the social or socio-pedagogical approach to coaching that we have, and we have that one interrelated line of thought, that for there we can move forward, and I think that's the key.
Gotcha. Perfect. So let's get our teeth into how you went about getting some of this data then. So went through, did this as an action research project through the PhD. What was the rationale for action research? How did you find the approach? I know some of your work is extending to, okay, well, what does action research actually look like? Where's the value? It's, sort of more explicitly. So you'll be back on the pod to explain a little bit more about that later on down the line. But tell us a bit about the rationale and how you found it for this particular project.
Yeah, so essentially it was, if to put a label on it, would be like a third-person technical piece of action research. So by that, I was working with 3 other coaches, and I had Vygotsky in mind as a theoretical framework that I was going to expose them to and try to enhance their practice with. But then also, of course, action research, we have to develop the theory as well. So hopefully there would be a bit of return from them in terms of developing the theory, in terms of what it looks like in practice for elite distance running coaches, for example. In terms of how I found it, I think at first one of the biggest issues I had was working with 3 coaches who, some of them had, when I was growing up, they were like some of the best athletes in the UK, and I was inspired by them, so to then go into their environments and try and essentially tell them what to do in a way. was quite daunting. And so I had to lean on a bit of, I guess, my knowledge of Vygotsky, because that's what they didn't have. They had the knowledge of, look, they've coached people to Olympic Games, so they know how to do that. I'm not trying to tell them how to do that, but I'm trying to get them to interrogate their own practice in relation to a theory that I know far better than they do.
Did you get any resistance to your approaches with them then?
I wouldn't say resistance. I don't think I could say that they just did everything I told them to, but I think that's in the way I presented it. We never stood at the track and I said, I think you should do this,
okay,
for example. But I might say something like, well, if you think about Vygotsky's work that we spoke about on the focus group last week around this concept, for example, one thing you might be able to do with that, and they might say, but that would get this response. And I say, okay, but do you not want that? And they might be like, okay. We might try things. It was different with the different coaches. I had one we did a lot of that. Like actually in the field work, I might be suggesting changes to do, and he would do that 30 seconds later, for example. I had another where we had some great conversations in between practice, but I never really would suggest something on in situ, if you like. But we would talk about concepts and he'd say, okay, I'm going to think about that when I coach. And then afterwards he'd say, I was thinking about this and that's why I did this there. And then we'd have unpick it. So it was different with the different coaches.
But you did want them to get to think with the ideas, didn't you? We've talked about, I think we've this in your podcast. Me and you did it, Mike. But wanted to think with these ideas, didn't you, of concept formation or mediation or zonal proximal development. Not to just, it wasn't just, I'm going to use this theory in practice, it's how can I think with this in relation to what I'm doing as a coach.
Yeah.
So slightly different, higher order thinking with that.
Mm-hmm. So was that part of the rationale for going for Vygotsky then? I guess that's the next question. Why Vygotsky? I know you've got a sort of personally quite fond of him because of your past experience, but which of his concepts are helping you out here? Which of his concepts did you sort of think Vygotsky's a nice one to sort of attack this action research with?
Yeah, I think that the issue I had with what already existed was that they had picked individual concepts and then gone with that, for example. So a large amount of the work on Vygotsky within coaching that was empirical was purely around the ZPD, for example, rather than viewing the ZPD as an analytic tool to then go and maybe alter practice. And so what Geth, myself and Robin kind of sat down with was we need to essentially just get them to be Vygotskyan coaches. So they're not just using Perishivani or mediation or dialectical thinking. Mm-hmm. It was to layer them up so that by the end they were just coaching with Vygotsky. And the title of the PhD was started with Coach Vygotsky. So essentially that's what I'd hope they, in a way, come across as now, still, but definitely during the data collection period, they were coaching with all of his ideas as one. But of course, that's where some of the tensions came in, that I had to present them in a way that was manageable. I didn't just give them everything at the start.
Yeah.
So we started with the cultural historical nature of their environments. We then moved to trying to mediate some ideas. We then went to Perishivani. And then we did some ZPD to try and understand really where their athletes are at. And it was actually the dialectical idea that came last, and that's what this paper that we're talking about today largely focuses on. And I think with that one, it meant that I had 11 months already in the field when I introduced dialectical engagement. So and this is where I've said in the paper that it's both almost an ethnographic finding in a way. It's what I've seen.
Mm-hmm.
And then towards the end we've had one cycle at the end of the action research, we've really started to alter how they work with that.
Okay. I guess that's probably one of the big strengths in not just the PhD, but this paper is about thinking about all of Vygotsky's ideas, not just singular ones. We'll all have seen it out in the research. It's one or two concepts that get pulled out. CPD, more knowledgeable other, because they're quite easy, simple, quite tangible things to grasp, I think. And then there's that neglect of well, actually the underpinnings of being cultural historical and imitation doesn't really appear despite ZPD being in there, and you don't see the Perishivani and the challenge that's meant to come with it, etc. So that's probably one of the, would you say you're sort of particularly happy with that coming through the paper? Because in your theoretical framework, you've managed to get, a lot of the ideas in without overcomplicating the paper as well at the same time, which made it quite easy reading, which was nice.
Yeah, and I think I've almost, in a way, that the way it's written, I have focused it around one of the theories. So it's almost I guess I'm shooting myself in the foot a bit there, but I think I presented it specifically in relation to one. But I think it's important to note that the data set has come from a 15-month period where all of these ideas have been explored.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, the findings of this focus on viewing that idea of being fast and running fast through dialectical thinking, but it's arisen from a project which is 15 months of Vygotskian coaching, or Vygotskian inspired coaching.
I'm quite interested in that sort of temporal aspect of it. Did it take 15 months to get to a point where you sort of thought, right now the dialectic stuff is going to come in? Or did you have it somewhat sort of mapped out in your head and it was just a bit of convenience that it happened to take that long to get to the sort of, well, just to get through all of the ideas before you eventually landed on dialecticism?
Yeah, I don't think it would have taken quite 15 months. I had COVID restrictions kind of. So we'd originally planned for like a 10 to 12 months. So we did have a bit of issues there, and we had would have been Tokyo Olympics as well.
Yeah.
So that was a bit of a kind of distraction as well from the research. But I planned the concepts in order, and we changed around two of them. So Perishivani was meant to come after ZPD from how I'd understood the literature on what might be needed next. And we brought that earlier, and then as ZPD afterwards. So it was quite largely, I guess, the plan was always to do that last. The thinking behind that was that you have to do a cultural historical understanding of what's going on first. That's the roots of Vygotsky. And then went mediation next, because to implement any ideas that are dialectical thinking, Perishivani, you need to mediate between athletes, between coaches, within the environment, for example. So that's fair, I guess.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that's part of the challenge of Vygotsky, though, right? Is trying to understand just how the ideas all interact with one another. These aren't ideas in silos. I mean, the aptly known Vygotsky module on the DSC, you go week by week and you go through concept by concept, but you hit week 7 and then all of a sudden you're thinking about, week 7 might very well be Perishivani. And now all of a sudden you're thinking about Perishivani still in relation to like week 1 and 2. So, but it's interesting that you've managed to get, a pretty much sort of nailed on plan of we go in this sort of order, whilst, there's constant interrelation between all of the different ideas, almost to a point where you could argue that we could go almost in any order if you really wanted to, and you'd eventually land at the same point, which is seeing them all come together.
Yeah, wouldn't you say? I think the initial part, the cultural historical part, and knowing it's going beyond knowing your environment. It's, you talk about assumptions as well. What are the underlying beliefs and values and everything of this group of this coach, isn't it, and this group of athletes? They've got different ways of making it to being successful. So that's what is a key thing. And it was surprising, wasn't it? Some people you could present it that you can explain a bit more about this, Oli, is how the environment was different, as in some would work more plush surroundings than others. But they still have, some of them would go to a local park to, you've got a real, an international athlete practicing with a coach on his bike, cycling with this athlete in a park with other, just where anybody can go. So that sort of sets the scene, but how does even, where that's the starting point to everything, isn't it, Oli, with it? Because that's where you found, wasn't it? In that initial stage, was it surprising for you?
Again, this is probably something that I was aware of from my own experiences of it, but seeing it and seeing it through a really theoretical lens made me understand why this might make the sport as it is, for example. So it's things I'd always been aware of, I'd always seen it myself, but I don't really stop to think about it. I think that goes back then to that, I guess, the personal reasoning for want to explore this particular aspect of the paper is that it was something that's been staring me in the face my whole life, but I didn't even realize it until I started to study it and to really go into those conversations with Geth and Robin and really unpick what is happening here.
Yeah. I guess that's kind of why I'm interested in the temporal nature of it, is that, when you start getting into the cultural historical piece, you start uncovering some of those assumptions or some of those quite tightly held beliefs about the way something should be done or currently is done. It takes quite a long time to unravel a lot of those things before you become almost open to a different idea or even an additional idea on top of what you're already doing. So,
Yeah.
And you've got to remember as well, Oli went into a situation where they were successful already. So there's lots of, the way track and field athletes are coached at the moment, it has proved to be successful, hasn't it? That's what we can't take away from this. Doing certain reps, certain structure to a session, they are the cutting edge maybe within the athletics world to be successful. So why wouldn't you use this approach that this coach uses or this athlete? And you get that, don't you? You can go online and find all the different kind of the coaching programs they do, how to develop in that way. So that's what you got to remember when you go in and try to change them, Thompson and Oli introducing these ideas. From a researcher point of view, it's about developing their trust, and that's what you're talking about by getting that buy-in initially. Is he's got to go in there. It helped. It helped that you were your athletics background, wouldn't it? It's because they did know of you, didn't they? Or they coached you maybe, or I can't remember what you said.
Yeah, so I kind of knew of the coaches, obviously, and they were kind of aware of me, but not so much from a performance perspective. But I think I quite quickly gained their approval in a way from my knowledge of the sport, for example. So we might, I don't know, say the Diamond League athletics been on the night before, and then I have a observation the next day. That conversation when you first meet in the morning and go get coffee together, for example, did you see Ingebrigtsen last night? What do you think of the race? That 30 seconds that I say then was so key to how much buy-in I had from them for the rest of the season, if you like.
And you could argue, and some of Vygotsky's point about the importance of language, isn't it? That the fact that you could speak the language in use in there, I can't even think of anything off the top of my head at the moment, but there must be specific language for that you saw within a session for athletics. Then you understood what they meant, and I think that comes out in some in the earlier findings as well, where you find out what the language in use is crucial as well.
Yeah, I guess just not being shocked by, because I could have gone in and I don't know, another researcher might go in and you go in first day and the coach is like, oh yeah, they're doing, I don't know, 20-mile run and then we'll go to the gym afterwards, for example. And you might be like, that's a lot. That's kind of, and yeah, it is a lot, but that's what they're all doing. They're all doing that. And it's not just that, it's 120-mile a week on week. Had the knowledge to speak the language I was fortunate enough, I ran with them a couple of times as well. So I'm not saying I'm good enough to race with them, but I could go on runs with them. I could go on an easy run with the athletes.
So quite a lot of this field work, if you like, was about fitting in, gaining that trust. So there's a methodological sort of finding here as well. Yeah. I don't know if it's necessarily specific to action research or stretches across ethnography and others, but actually just finding your place in that environment was pretty key to you being able to have the access and have the agency to introduce any of these concepts over that extended period of time then.
Yeah, and I think with running, there's only so much coaching you can do while the session's going on. So if the session's 10 by 400 and you need to run them in 64 or 60, whatever it is, you can't really, and this is where it speaks to the being fast, right? The physiology, that's what you need to do that day. No questions. So there's certain days where that's just what you need to do. And obviously you might change it a little bit. You might tweak the recoveries, whatever, but they might just stand there in time. And I would help them stand there in time We then go for breakfast afterwards. And then you're having the conversation there about what that session really meant or what the run's going to be like later that day. And it was fitting in enough for them to want me to come to breakfast afterwards.
Yeah.
Because you say to, I guess, people who've not done field work, and you say, oh, yeah, you come to the sessions. But they might not invite you for dinner or to brunch. Or they might not say, oh, I know you need to do a run today, because they're aware I was doing some running. So why don't you just run with the guys?
But then what's important then, and this is, we forget sometimes that this is where coaching happens. Coaching isn't just about standing on the track here. Yeah. When you go for breakfast or you go for dinner or whatever, you go for a coffee and drink, you'd say a lot of their coaching would happen there. And so that's where we tend to forget sometimes, don't we? We always think about how we can improve things, on the track or on the field. But here, it's you can see the relationship between being a researcher here, maybe as a coach as well. How you develop the relationships and get to influence people and do things in that way as well.
I think you use word, being obsessed with it. It's like, totally immersing yourself in that world in order to just carry on existing, to gain access to those opportunities. I know Sophia spoke about that in an episode where we talked about coaching as a sort of almost like seductive kind of sort of act. We talk about charming. As a researcher going into that environment, it was initially, okay, no, you don't need to come to this meeting, it's okay. And then it developed into, come and sit in the room with us. And then all of a sudden she's being drawn into conversations. And it's that point then you really get to experience and see, well, what's actually happening within coaching then. It's above and beyond just being on the court or the pitch or whatever it might be. So there's some commonalities there, but I think just such an important message to get through. The data we'll talk about now, or your findings we'll talk about now, but just accessing that in the first place is something pretty critical that comes through here. So findings then, the bit that everyone's here for. You've split this section into issues, actions, consequences. And I know you're a little bit in two minds on exactly if that's going to be what the final version looks like, but for the sake of talking through, we'll go through those in order. So let's start with the issues then. What were the issues that became apparent in the fieldwork? What kind of things were you seeing?
Some of the initial issues were essentially the coaches being aware of a need to, like Gev said, prepare an athlete for a race, and aware that was really important. But then there being a tension with that awareness, the conversation we're having, and then the training that they perhaps prescribed. So if I read from one of the field notes, for example, and this is inspired by Renato Canova's marathon training, which basically all the top marathoners are doing a version of this. And one of the coaches was talking about how he's doing this rep at 103% of marathon pace, right? And then the next rep he's going to do 105%. And he's running this 30 seconds slower than race pace for the recoveries, for example. The coach's kind of reflection on that was, he's going really well. He's basically ready. Like we're having a conversation and he's watching the athlete run past. They're doing it at this exact pace, and that means he's ready. And then he says to me, but I need to get the race in his mind. I need to get the Olympics in his mind. So I'm thinking to myself, well, he's not ready then, is he? What? We're physically ready, but you've just told me we're not actually ready. So what are we doing? I need to get this in his mind. But then the session stays the same and we just carry on. And then after the session, great session. It's brilliant. But we've just had this discussion where, so the coach is aware, the coach knows that this is a problem, but then we've just gone to the physiology again. And this is where, I guess it goes back to the original point, that the physiology is so important. And I by no means was sitting there thinking, well, he needs to change the session and they need to do something that is completely different. But how can we get the Olympics in his mind whilst we do that? Rather than a separate conversation where we go for brunch, then we say, have you thought about the race? Because then again, yeah, we can chat about the race all we like, but you're not running and thinking about the race. And when the race comes along, we're in the race and you're running. You're having to perform whilst having all these other things going through your mind.
So what's your interpretation of that? Is that the coaches they just can't let go of this physiological underpinning, or is it because there's an absence of ideas of how to bring the Olympics into that training environment?
I think a lot of it just comes from that's just what's been done. And at the same time, this athlete's already qualified for the Olympics, so they're doing pretty well already. So I guess it's not. I think, and I'm sure this happens in other sports as well. Like we have big game players, right? People like that, and a lot of the, I guess the arguments from coaches is, they're just wired that way. They just know how to race. Naturally, they have this nous, or they have this ability to bring it on the big stage. We never really talk about where that comes from, or actually, if an athlete doesn't have that because he's not come from somewhere in their upbringing or their cultural history, how are we going to coach that? We can't just responsibilities off. I can't teach that. They do the whole you can't teach that argument.
Yeah.
But they've learned it somewhere. Someone's taught, maybe not directly, and I think we have a responsibility as coaches, as coaching researchers, to teach that.
I think the idea is if I can train someone to run at this speed, physiologically, get the timings right, if they've done all the training, they'll be able to reproduce that, and in when they go and compete, without consideration that what does it mean to compete? What goes on in the race, and everything else that comes with that. And I think there is an assumption there that if I can get somebody to the peak fitness and they can do this, that they will do this. They will just translate this, linear transfer straight onto the track.
Some assumptions that are a little bit stuck in. Well, I don't want to say stuck, but because it's just what's done. But there's a lack of understanding of those contextual factors around the outside of a race that don't happen to exist in the training environment. Mm-hmm. And that probably comes from, I see that as a lack of understanding about things like cultural historical theory. Okay, so you just blame it on nature versus nurture. Mm-hmm. I can't teach that, so it's not my responsibility. Well, that emanates from a lack of understanding about, what does learning even look like in the first place? How is it that, like you say, an Inga Britson of the world just knows how to just pull it off in a big race, or or a Lyles in the 100-meter final just manages to overcome a couple of bad performances and COVID maybe to just all of a sudden be better at a 100-meter final. Well, he must have learned that somewhere. It's not just miraculous ability.
Yeah, and I mentioned Canova earlier in terms of his marathon training. He always talks about this idea of he's never seen a miracle in a marathon. You might see it in some shorter events, so maybe in the 100, you can just pull it off somehow. I'm not saying Lyles did, for example, but maybe it's more likely. But distance running, the longer you go, I'm sure there's. You've run a marathon, Mike.
Running is a loose word there. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think, and a lot of people, like you say, running is booming. A lot of people can relate from doing park runs, doing marathons. There is no escaping the physical training, but when you get to the Olympic level, or even the top level in the UK, for example, pretty much everyone on the start line, if you put them in a lab, they're very similar. So what is going to be the point of difference? And it's more than training.
Yeah, you've got me thinking quite a lot about just some of the things that come out of tennis coaches when we talk about, okay, great, it can hit a 120 mile an hour serve down the tee, but can you do it at 30 all, 4 all in the third set of a match?
Yeah.
So all of a sudden that's a very different environment when there's nerves involved. We talk about some players just, he tightens up when it gets to this point here, so don't worry. I'm like, well, okay, if you know he tightens up, why are you not doing something about that? Why are you not trying to support that athlete through that? And quite often I feel like the turn is to go, speak to someone from psychology to go, how can you overcome nerves, or how can you be more resilient under pressure, or whatever it might be, rather than actually think, what can I do in my coaching to try and bring that environment to life a little bit more, so it gets that experience of the pressure and the tension that comes with being pretty close in a match, and there's a lot riding on it.
And this is the continuous whole, right? It's not going and cherry picking from other ideas. It's ensuring that, so 105% of merit, it's ensuring that physiology is a part of all training practices.
Yeah.
But that is together with that race preparation or with their understanding of what that actually feels like. So we might run at a certain pace and we check the lactate, and that might be right. But what does the athlete actually feel during that? And so we're not arguing for feel over physiology or physiology over feel. It's just one and the same. Or even the psychology. The psychology is part of it, but in the moment, in the practice, together at the same time, not just, oh, that was difficult today, so go see the psychologist, or you didn't look very strong, so go see the S&C coach. It's all in the moment. It's all happening.
And it's just, back to your tennis example there, that situation is going to happen in the game. At some point, that will happen. Deuce, 4-all, on your serve. It's going to happen. Now, we're not saying you have to be physically ready to do the serve, but then you've got to consider what options you have. What can you do as what types of serve, as you know better than me. What am I going to do here? And that isn't just about physically being able to do it. You've got to make a judgment on lots of things. The conditions, maybe even the feel of the game. Or what's your opponent? What's been going on with your opponent, and then back to what have I got confidence of doing? But that doesn't come, just that becomes making a decision of the best thing to do in the game at that moment in time, and it may not be the 130 down the middle. It may be a slice serve to the backhand or something like that. That kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's probably what I'd go for, to be honest. Just try and roll one into that half of the court and hope for the best. What you're touching on there, I suppose, a little bit is building into this next part, which is sort of the actions. That sort of mixture or that melding together of the physiology and the feel. There's an example here. You talk about a coach shouting, you hear that's the sound of VO2, rather than, okay, this is your current VO2 level as such. It's more of a, okay, how's this? What does VO2 or working at your VO2 max, what does it feel like? So tell us a little bit. You've sort of introduced some of the concepts of Vygotsky, and the coaches are maybe starting to put this kind of thing into practice. So what are the actions that come out of that then?
Yeah, and this is where it's probably, I guess, Geth mentioned earlier, leaning on previous work who've done something in this space, and that there is a body of research around kind of more social or phenomenological appreciations of running, for example. So ditching the watch or running to feel. And whilst I think that some of that work is absolutely brilliant, I'm trying to just extend it a bit if I can, in terms of trying to bring it back to the physiology. So rather than let's ditch the physiology, like you say, okay, coaches, let's be a bit more creative. Let's run 10 by 60 seconds rather than 10 by 400. And we'll run it from a starting point on the track that's not necessarily your usual 400 start. But as they go in, how can you get them to make those associations with the physiological training that you're trying to get from them? So that's the sound of VO2. So I start associating in my head, that sort of breathing is towards my VO2 max. So maybe, I guess over time, we get to the point where in 6 months' time, I'm racing a 5K and I'm like, okay, this is a bit too quick because I'm associating the sort of breathing now. There's a point where I can't really come back from. And so when the race comes, I start to understand that, because in the race, we're not getting any readings. Yeah, you might wear a GPS watch, for example, in a road race, but a lot of time you're getting split times, but you're never getting blood lactate or oxygen feedback like some of these pro athletes are getting every single session.
That feel bit I find quite interesting, especially talking about the watches, because I'm obsessed with this thing here.
Yeah.
Pointing for those just listening, that's my very old Garmin watch, but it tells me my split times, and that split time looks a certain way depending on how I'm feeling. So sometimes I can run a 5:30 kilometers, not miles. I can run a 5:30 and I'm breathing out my ears almost, trying to suck some oxygen in. I'm really, really struggling. But there's other days where I look at 5:30 and I'm like, well, this is great. I feel like I'm cruising. Now, if I went and ran without my watch, I would do the whole thing based on my breathing. I'm going too fast, or I'm not going fast enough, or I can go faster. So rather than boiling it down to data, I'm doing it more on feel. But that's not to say that I should be neglecting the time and pace that I'm actually running at as such. It's difficult to get a best of both worlds, right? Especially when we've got all these devices and things. Because if I have this on my wrist, I'm going to look at it. But I also kind of need to run with it in order to get the time, even if I am doing it based on feel, so I can match feel with the time that I'm actually running. So is it tricky to get to sort of achieve this for, I don't want to say for your layman, but for those that are sort of running recreationally, socially? Is it difficult to get this melding together? Or do you need to have a little bit of the, the measurement tools, some of the data that's coming off a watch, for example, in order to mix feel and physiology together?
I think it comes to the need of a coach, right? In the so maybe I don't think it's on the level of the athlete or necessarily the technology available to them, but if you've got a coach who can start making these associations for you, it's not just over to people coaching themselves, and that's where Vygotsky's ideas about more knowledgeable others come in. I mean, of course, we can have more knowledgeable other in more knowledge. So the Garmin, for example, might give you some more knowledge about what is going on, but ultimately it's up to a coach, and we don't want to make the coach redundant, right? That's our that's our space. So it's up to them to ensure that their athletes are having a sufficient blend of both. And I think the point you make there, Mike, you take the watch away, and that might be brilliant for you on that day for that run. But go to this elite environment, and I make the point in the paper that, but depending on their event, for example, they're all running between 8 and 13 times every week, 1 to 3 gym sessions, and then I guess the 800 athletes who might be doing 60 mile a week, and the marathoners are doing 120 mile a week. That is a prerequisite. So somewhere along the line, they need to get that done within the week. So marathon, they need to do 120 mile a week. They need to do, I don't know, maybe 30 miles at threshold or quicker. And they need to do one run that's at least 20 miles, for example. So the technology is great because it tells us, yeah, we've hit that. And so if we do that for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, a whole Olympic cycle, we're going to be in a pretty good place physiologically. So that's where the technology is really useful for us. The blood lactate is really useful because threshold, for example, as well, can change like day to day based on how you feel. And then you might use heart rate, for example, to say, oh, you're not feeling so great. And you might get a threshold reading and pull someone from a session because their lactate's too high, or you give them an extra recovery. So that knowledge is super useful. But I think it goes back to what we're speaking about the race. You're not going to get that. You don't know when to ease back in the race. And sometimes you can't ease back because if you ease back, your medal's gone. So how can we, in practice, break some of those down at certain times? It's not every run, let's lose the watch, or every run we need to be kind of running purely to feel. But over the course of a week or within a week, how creative can we be within the kind of pillars that we need?
And it is challenging when you think, back to athletics again, because, in the Diamond League and things, they've got pacemakers. So, that's where that can give you a false sense of security that they're running with the pacemaker in there. So really we're talking about racing to try the combination here is when you're racing with someone. As Oli hinted there, the further you go, maybe it's much harder to influence things in that way. But ultimately, when it comes to the these medals, worlds or European or Commonwealth, or is there a Commonwealth Games now? But there is still or the Olympics. It comes down to how you run the race, and sometimes you can run your personal best and you don't get anything, but they've run the race really well, and that's that's what you find. Even sometimes you can win the Olympic gold with a slower time than anyone who competed 4 years previously. But that's what it comes about, running the race and knowing yourself well enough to be able to be physically ready, what we're saying, and that you coach that you're physically ready, but at the same time you coach that you understand how to run the race and how to make the judgment of when to go, when not to go. As Oli said, I may have to go here and I may blow up in the end, but if I don't go here, I've got no chance of winning or getting a medal.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you saw a little bit of this, I guess, in some of the consequences then of the work, and you spoke particularly about how coaches should take a little bit more care with their language, and you actually saw a little bit of some of the changing in language, or sort of starting to athletes and coaches starting to share a bit of a repertoire of language to explain those feelings of, okay, this is me when I'm running at threshold of VO2 max versus this is what it's like when I'm running up hills, etc. What's the consequence of all of that then in terms of what the athletes were saying or what the coaches were saying about what's actually happening then as a result of their practice and what you've been working on with them?
Like you said, Mike, it's developing that shared understanding between the kind of individual coach-athlete relationships that they had within the group. So it wasn't just, I'm going to now coach every athlete I do with the same language. I need to really take care. And so one thing that I found quite interesting was this idea of wowing younger or newer athletes with science, right? And they probably came in with more of they actually already had this preconceived idea of what they felt, because they've come from environments like you say. You kind of mentioned how it might apply to someone who's just out going for a run more recreationally, where they don't have access to lactates. So they came in with actually a really good understanding of feel, and some of the coaches were trying to then upskill them to determine what their existing feel or understanding of how they felt when they were running meant in the lab. So they'd actually use loads of science. So you join in the group, we're going to take your lactate all the time to get you to understand, right, you feel like this, and this is what the hard science is telling us that looks like for you right now. Athletes that have been with the group for 10, 15 years, they're hardly getting the lactate monitor out, because the coach knows if he says, run steady, or our boys like, yeah, be conversational, see how you feel, have a bit of fun with it. They know exactly what that means. And if you got the lactate monitor out, which they did on occasion, is bang on what the coach wants, because they've developed that shared language over time of what that means. So they're getting the desired physiological response without necessarily having to go and use it.
And there's an important bit that you're sort of referring to, where coaches have got new people joining the group and they make assumptions that people will just know what they're talking about because of the way that it's done in athletics. You know, if they go heavy on the physiology or certain language that's comfortable, and they just assume that people know what that language is. It comes back again to this idea of cultural history. Well, someone's language is different, even if they're talking about the same thing. There's an element of building that shared language in order to just get on, in order to be able to communicate effectively, etc.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things that not directly linked to the findings in this paper that we had was the social hierarchy and order of the runners within groups, and that the coach felt like that they actually only needed to tell the fastest athletes in the group what pace to run. Because I don't know if you go for a run with Mike, I don't know, I might
Jeff
say
normally watches me run, in fairness. I've run past him a few times on the marathon.
He was looking good in the marathon a few weeks ago, I've got to say.
For example, Mike might be the superior athlete in that scenario, or Geth might be when it comes to the sprinting, for example. I might say to you, Mike, if you run steady, for example, or you run tempo pace, because generally the more experienced athletes in the group, the faster ones, have also been with the coach longer. That kind of tends to be how it goes. And so they're setting a pace that they already have that shared understanding, that shared repertoire. New athletes in the group then essentially slot in, and over the first few weeks, months, they find their place within the group without you necessarily needing to tell them to run quicker or slower. They're just finding their social order based off, they've run that time over 10K and I've run this. So if they're doing that in this session, I might find my place back here, for example. And generally they end up doing some good physiological work there. And then that's when you might bring the lactate monitor out and you say, oh yeah. And they're like, oh, well, I didn't know I was doing it so well, but I was. So there are a few different ways, and it was different with the different groups as well. But I think what's important is if athletes are talking about the physiology, if they are really aware of the physiology, they're being essentially coached by their watch at times, bring them back and bring them more towards the everyday. And the same the other way. If athletes are really obsessed with how they feel and they're a bit, I guess, tentative about exploring some of that harder science, and bring them more towards that, so we can find some sort of the continuous whole, that one interrelated line of thought that only works between that one athlete and that one coach, not necessarily throughout a group. And if we can find that space, then I think they're going to be in a good place.
I know we're talking about in sort of a group setting there, and when we talk about social order, enough people on board with that language, then it's typically going to sort of filter down into new athletes joining the group, etc. You're making a bit of a case here, though, that language needs to be somewhat, I don't want to say individually, but sort of language needs to be a bit more specific between individuals rather than trying to abide by. It's a bit of a loaded question here because of my experiences of education myself and working in tennis, rather than trying to abide by just a set language for this is how we talk about the sport and there is no flex around that. That's the best way to talk about it.
I think so, particularly in an individual sport. I think it's more important, I don't know, football, hockey, rugby, there needs to be that shared repertoire amongst the players. Like if you're going to press in a certain way, you can't do the team talk 11 times, right? Individual sports, particularly at the level of the coaches I was working with, they might have eight athletes who they can be considered like their elite athletes. You probably do have time to go through with each and every one of them and talk about what the session means. They might choose not to, and this goes back to the racer, right? They might tell one athlete what physiological output they want from the session, and that's the kind of the action there in the action research is we might speak about. You tell one athlete and you see what everyone else does in relation to that. If they're able to then adapt and train appropriately for them in that time and space, you're like, okay, they're all right. But then maybe others, you need to then halfway through, you need to come in and say, yeah, what I really want out of this session from you is this. And it might be to run too quick, essentially too quick for threshold, which is a lot of the training we do. You mentioned Ingebrigtsen zone 2 running. But it's just to go with everyone today, or to track that athlete, for example.
But this was linking to some of Vygotsky's zone and proximal development ideas where you're talking about how it looks like, how to think with it in practice, yeah?
Yeah, and also I guess with the ZPD, it was this idea of like a physiological and a mental ZPD, or our more traditional kind of conceptual ZPD of what do I know? But then when you get into sports in general, you have an ability that restricts you from, I can know, say tennis, right? I could know what shot to play. Hockey, rugby, football is the same. I could know what I need to do, but you have to know your own physical ability in order to know the right kind of approach for you in that moment.
And I think I think it was you were speaking with Oli when we were talking about some people, say again in the Olympics or whatever, would make an heroic effort to try and win gold then, and would go maybe beyond what they were capable of, and they'd end up coming 7th or 8th. While the other people wouldn't do that, would they? And then looking for the third. Was it with you or something with that? And again, where do you understand? So some of them would not go and push them to the extent, but you could say, well, they understood they're never going to win, but they just went to go and get third. Well, that one person who should maybe have come 3rd or 2nd went for it to try and win, but in the end comes 7th. So that's, again, knowing your capabilities maybe.
I guess that for me is probably why I'm a coach, not a player, because I could probably tell you all the things you should be doing on a tennis court. Whether I'm capable of them is something else. That's why people become coaches, right?
Yeah, and what we get into trying is sharing these ideas to think was is to be able to understand that, the idea of feel, and that kind of language of the idea of being in that zone, in that area where you're comfortable, and where are you? Can I push myself? But then, having the conceptual understanding then is useful to get along in order to push yourself, in order to experience the everyday. So when you put the link between feel and the physiological, well, that's how actually I feel about it. That's how it feels to me. Now that's quite useful to have when you're in the race and you haven't got anything to give you that, provide you that.
So just to wrap up the paper then, any sort of key messages, any final thoughts that you want to sort of emanate out of the paper that you can give across to the listeners now?
Yeah, I think it's essentially goes back to the Vygotskian literature, and that's why we used it as both like a vehicle for change, but also a lens through which to understand what was going on. In that, I guess the coaches or even researchers looking in this area don't lean on the everyday, so that in this instance the feel, or lean on the hard science like too much. Always find a balance if you can, and that might fluctuate. That could be fluctuating throughout a session, it could be fluctuating throughout a season, and it goes back to something Gef's work on kind of scaffolding over a period of time, for example. But I think there's potential dangers in leaning on one or the other, because the reality, the race, real life is both. It's always both. You're never gonna go and just get tested in the lab and win the Olympic gold because you have the best VO2 max. And you're never just gonna just jump in the Olympic final and win because of a miracle, because of just performing on that day. There's a certain physiological prerequisite. I think that stretches across all sports. So it's not about ignoring physiology, and it's not about and it's not about purely coaching socially. It's about prescribing more social and interactional ideas that I guess challenge some of the deep-rooted ideas from history about physiology, but also work with them. It's all encompassing, essentially.
Great. So to close then, I'm assuming you've got a few sort of tucked up your sleeve from all of the times you've been asking people for myths about sport coaching that you want to challenge, but we'll see now. Any myths from either of you that you just want a quick minute or two to rant, dispel, just put to bed before we finish?
You can rant, because I keep repeating
Geff
myself.
always has one.
I think I always do the same. It's always the same one, I think. I keep going back to the same one every time.
So I tried to think about this in relation to the paper itself, and I think for me it's the idea that training planning is coaching, but it's also not coaching. And it goes back to this continuous whole idea, because I think there's this train of thought that we have. I don't know, if you set a training plan, some people think, oh, that's coaching, and other people think, oh no, that's not coaching because you're just setting a plan. But the research around endurance sports, or just the reality of endurance sports, is that planning the training and planning the physiology is just as much a part of the coaching as the interactional bit. But I think it's just it goes back to the final.
And just to add to that, what you tend to get, not just in individual sports, in team sports, is people think they have to change the plan and then the success will happen. There is this relational stuff we come back to, and we're not saying that you don't change the plan, but sometimes just changing the plan itself, right? Yeah, that's not, that will make, if I do more of this and more of that, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have, the cause and effect. So, I think people misunderstand sometimes here at Cardiff Met. They think we're just all social, but it's how it's looking at the wider picture of it all. Look at the sport, what is needed. How do we coach this sport?
And it's social within the confines of the sport, that there are certain things we have to do.
Yeah, and you will. There is an interpretive element to data. As in you can be quite subjective on data, and we know that. In different sports, you can be subjective how you use. Even the athletics coaches would probably use the data in a subjective way in order to make a point or a power play on the athlete.
Yeah.
Oh, you haven't trained very well today. Look at you. Look what you've done. You're 3 seconds down, or your max level is down there. There's lots of things going on in that way.
Nice, like that one. So thank you both for coming on. I hope you enjoyed your first experience behind the other set of mics. Geff, thanks for coming back. Many thanks again to all the sports broadcast team as well, Nick and Ellie in the booth for us, and thanks to all of our listeners for joining in. We'll be back very soon for another episode, so make sure you subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Cardiff Met Sports Coaching Hub podcast.
If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a rating and a review on your favourite podcast platform. If you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe.
If you want to stay up to date with all of the latest work coming out of the Coaching Hub, please follow us on social media. All the relevant links are in the description.
And if you'd like to be featured in an upcoming listener special episode, drop us your questions to coachinghub@cardiffmet.ec.uk.